you.
Yes, why don't we start with you instead of with the book?
Okay.
I think that would be very useful to
I
know
like
something
talking about myself, so that's all right.
don't we all? But actually you started out as a scholar in literature.
Yes, I had a slightly circuitous route to publication because from the very earliest age I had been drawn to literature and writing and storytelling with a kind of visceral pull, which I think is probably like the pull a lot of women have towards motherhood, a sort of feeling that my life would have no purpose without storytelling. And I'm the youngest of 5 girls, but I would be the one that they would make tell the bedtime stories to if we were in a room together. And I had a sort of constant unspooling of story in my head the whole time. So I would get on a bus and see someone on the bus, and then by the end of the bus journey be in tears because of a sort of wrenching novella that I'd written about them in my head. But I didn't do any actual writing. And when I left university, I did English at university and I needed to earn a living, so I joined the civil service, which is absolutely the worst thing to do if you're a creature of imagination, is to work for the Department of Work and Pensions on statistics of employment in the Midlands of the UK, and just became terribly miserable and realised it was because I had severed myself off from what I wanted to do. So when I was 26, I did an MA and then a PhD in creative writing.
On Gothic, on the place.
Yeah, so the title of so technically speaking, my subject was creative writing in the Gothic. So I wrote for my PhD, my first novel, but also wrote a big thesis on the Gothic sense of place. And don't ask me about the Gothic because I will talk about it for 50 minutes without pausing for breath. And the novels of Iris Murdoch, and sort of learning about Gothic convention and Gothic sensation and what that means. And the reason I did that was because I wrote this first novel and my supervisor tapped the manuscript.
After Me Comes the Flood.
After Me Comes the Flood, yeah. And he said, "You're a Gothic novelist." And I said, "Are we sure?" Because there's no vampires or maidens.
But there's a house.
There's a house,
yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So I began to study the Gothic. I began to study the importance of place in fiction, of how place can function as a character. I was fortunate enough for that book to be published, which led to me writing this and the next and so on. So.
But after Me Comes the Flood really is in a house most of the time.
It is,
but
yeah.
This one is mostly outdoors.
Yes.
And still it's a Gothic in a way.
Yes, and the very great novelist Sarah Waters, who wrote those wonderful Gothic neo-Victorian novels, I did an event with her early on in my career, and she's incredibly supportive of new writers and very supportive and kind to me. And we did an event on stage, and I said, "Landscape can be Gothic," and she went, "No." And I've just been corrected by a very great writer, but I stand by it. I think the natural world can be Gothic. It's very unconventional to think of it that way.
But if you look at the Bronte sisters, for instance, landscape is Gothic there.
Exactly.
And actually, since I've never been to Essex, when I read your novel, The Essex Serpent, I thought more about literature than about nature. I've been to Dorset. That's very different.
Wessex. Yeah. That's right. Well, I don't know. My whole sensibility involves investing objects and place, whether interior or exterior, with meaning. And this is actually in some ways a slightly unfashionable thing to do. So when I did my MA, if you wanted to use the pathetic fallacy, as we call it, so someone's walking along and they feel sad and it starts to rain, and people would mock it. But I would say everybody knows this isn't real. We know this is art. So why not deploy all of the artistic tools at your fingertips? So if you want to have a scene where people are loosed from social convention and reduced to a kind of animalistic, why not have it happen outside? And if you want to show people confined and restrained, why not have that in an interior setting? So I'm very happy with using artifice, and I think that's what leads to this exploration of the Gothic in landscape.
But you talk about, or you write about Essex as if it was a remote part of Siberia. But it's really very close to London.
It is, yeah. So I don't know if you know this, and I don't know if Sweden has an analogue for this, whether there's something very similar, but Essex is a joke in the UK. So it's nobody visits. An Essex girl, which I am, is considered to be a lady of negotiable virtue, who wears high-heeled white stiletto shoes, and Essex people are supposed to be very vulgar and very ill-educated and very brash. And when I was growing up, people would joke about Essex girls and so on. And it's because it's lost its identity. So if you look at a map of London, Essex abuts it like a next-door neighbour, and you can go to Essex on the Underground. Upminster, it runs on the London Underground. But if you keep going east, you find yourself on Mersey Island, where there are still oyster beds, where they have been farming oysters for 2,000 years since the Romans, and where if you don't turn your car round and come back, you'll be cut off by the tides. So it's both. It's kind of extremely remote and eerie and strange, and it's also London. So it's a perfect, for an exploration of the kinds of themes that are in the book, it's the ideal place, really.
And to this place comes your heroine, you could say, Cora Seaborn. Seaborn. Yes, of course, Seaborn.
Yeah.
Born out of
She's called Seagrave quite a lot in online. When people review it, they often call her Seagrave, and I thought I would have drowned her if that's...
Names are important in this.
They are, yeah. They were very carefully chosen. Yeah. Will Ransom's name is supposed to indicate... Is he
paying ransom?
He's sort of torn between free will, and self-fulfillment, and self-agency, and Christian theology of being ransomed from sin. So he's sort of supposed to indicate these two things. So I had a lot of fun. Again, I'm just really happy with the fact that a novel is artifice, so you might as well choose the names to mean something as not.
I agree with you. Let's talk about not the plot, but the setting in this novel. It starts with a death, 2 deaths actually, and one of them is the death of your heroine's husband. Yeah, and it's a death that makes her both happy and sad. And that's very interesting, I think.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad. I'm very interested in equivocation. I think in all things, in matters of emotion, in matters of ethics, virtue, and morality, we very rarely feel or think in a direct kind of Manichaean black and white way. Life would be so much easier if we did. And one of the things I also like doing is playing with the expectations of the reader. So you have a Victorian widow, one immediately thinks of grieving and of black-edged handkerchiefs and lilac flowers. Well, she didn't do any of that. Equally, she was an abused wife. So you think, well, she'll just be delighted to be shot of him. But that's not quite the case either. So at all times, I tried to show that equivocation in feeling. And also, for the purposes of the plot, it was very helpful that she would be a widow with some money. So, it was a very useful thing to do, was to murder that dreadful man before the book had even started. So. Yeah.
Actually, you said yourself it's Victorian. In this case, it means it plays in 1890 something.
Yes, yeah. I specifically didn't mention the year. Yeah. Yes, I was... One of the things that really interests me is the nearness of the past. So it's very easy to other the past for various reasons, to say we've moved on, we're not like that anymore. We must forget about it. They were foolish. They covered their piano legs in shawls. You know, ladies never left the house. None of which is true. The thing about covering up piano legs was a joke that an American guy wrote back to his family, satirising something or other, and it became stuck as an idea of how prudish and narrow and confined the Victorians were. So what I wanted to do was to write a book set in the Victorian times, but show it as having been a modern age, which it was. So the analogy that I always use is this. I want you to imagine a man waking up in the morning with toothache. He's really grumpy about having toothache, and his wife says to him, you shouldn't put so much marmalade on your toast because the sugar's bad for you. He says, all right. And it's really cold, so he's warming himself by the radiators, and he's got to get dressed. He puts on a black suit for work, and he goes onto the Underground, and he picks up the Times, and he reads in the Times about the war in Afghanistan and a trades union Congress strike, and then he gets off the Underground and he goes to work at the Prudential Insurance Company, but his toothache is intolerable, so he has to go to the dentist. So he has injections for, he has anaesthetic for his tooth, has the tooth out, it's a bit grumpy, so he goes home and his wife gives him some Cadbury's hot chocolate to cheer him up. All of that in every detail could have happened in 1893 and yesterday. Everything. The newspaper, the place of work, the tooth, the jam, the toast, the radiator.
The circle line.
The circle line. So what I wanted to do was to lift the Victorian age out of this kind of top hats and mutton chop whiskers and silent wives and street urchins into the modern age that it actually was by the end, which has really confused and annoyed quite a lot of people. But
yeah, and you really make some effort making us see that. For instance, when Cora comes with chocolate to her friend Stella, you mentioned that she bought it at Harrods. So everything is recognizable.
Yes, and we had to cut some stuff because you have to tread a very careful line between pricking your reader's interest and lurching them out of the book. So Sainsbury's is our big supermarket in the UK, and Sainsbury's was up and running by the end of the 19th century. So someone says something like, where do these people go for their cheese? They can't even go to Sainsbury's. And my editor just said, it's just a step too far. You can't quite, that's too far. But Harrods we got away with, so yeah.
Okay, at the same time, it is a remote place and age. Yeah. Even if it's very modern in some ways for its days. But one of the conflicts in the book, or one of the tensions, is between all that was modern in those days. Science, you could do things in medicine that you couldn't do before. Yeah. This was an age where people were obsessed with various kinds of scientific newities, and at the same time, Will Ransom, as you talked about, he is a deeply religious man, although he reads Darwin. Yeah. But I think with him, it's not so much the tension between religion and science as between religion and superstition.
Exactly, yeah. So it's about playing with the expectations of the reader. So Cora, when she hears that she is to be introduced to this vicar, she thinks, oh, country parson, he's going to be really old and superstitious and stuck in his ways. And actually, he's read Darwin, he's read Marx, he's very rational. What he doesn't like is everybody sinking into superstition and fear. And you think Cora, the atheist, Darwin-loving widow, will be rational and calm and considered, and of course she's none of those things. But the tussle between faith and reason is really the great preoccupation of my life, I think, and is in everything that I've written, probably will continue to be. And one of the things that I think we're quite uncomfortable with is the idea that actually faith and reason have often cohabited quite happily for centuries. So the Enlightenment was powered to a certain extent by a religious faith. The rationale was, if the universe was created by a God of reason, we must be able to understand it. It's not just a sort of strange canvas of explosions and myths and superstitions. It's maths. You can calculate the orbit of a planet. Stars are fixed in the sky according to certain patterns of movement. And Halley's Comet, Halley, who discovered Halley's Comet, someone wrote a poem to Halley and wrote about how his faith in God had sort of powered what he was doing. So, you know, I'm sort of trying to challenge the idea that you're either a nice, sensible, rational person who understands gravity, or you go to church and you believe in fairies. You know, it's not quite that straightforward.
You had a religious upbringing yourself. Very
I did,
religious.
yeah, and I can't quite think, I don't know what the equivalent would be for you, but I was brought up in what we call strict Baptist faith, and the nearest equivalent that I can think of is to tell you that I was born in about 1880. So we had no pop music, no television, no cinema, no dancing, no cards, long hair, no makeup, long skirts, no jeans, no contemporary literature in the house, nothing like that. But it was incredibly rich in other ways. So it was really like a 19th century upbringing. So I'm a cracking embroiderer. I can play the piano rather nicely. I'm like Mary Bennett from... I did painting, dressmaking, gardening, reading, and the house was full of literature. So I read Jane Eyre when I was 8. I read Shakespeare for pleasure as a child. We read only the King James 1611 Bible, recited that at sort of enormous length. At every meal time we would read from the 1611 Bible. So I think often, as we were saying, people like to think that religious upbringings are necessarily deprived and strange and difficult. Mine was difficult, lots of upbringings are difficult, but they always say, was it like Jeanette Winterson in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit? You know, do you speak to your parents? And when I say I actually really enjoyed it because I wanted to stay home listening to adaptations of Greek tragedies on the radio while doing watercolour copies of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Much rather do that than go to the school disco. And they're sort of slightly taken aback. And I don't go to church anymore, and people wonder if I've been cast out from the family, but, you know, we're all very close.
But this is a Victorian novel.
It is. I think it's a Victorian novel about a contemporary Victorian age. So the structure of the novel, the narration of the novel, it has a very present narrator, an omniscient narrator with an opinion. That's very, very Victorian. It has consciously, in a Dickensian way, a social conscience. So it's a Victorian novel in its form, but in its content, it's a different kind of 19th century. I really enjoy that play and looking at form and looking at style and working out sort of how to invert them or pay tribute to them at the same time.
I mean, you said that the theme of belief or faith and science, or belief and knowledge, or whatever, that this really is a core theme with you. But you can also say that you have a lot of there are a lot of people in this novel, and there are a lot of conflicts, or both between class and social conscience, and there's a doctor who can operate in a way that we can do today, but really couldn't do in those days, but started to be able to do.
Just began.
And then we have this Martha, this woman, this Cora's friend, or even maid, you could say, something between
companion,
who is who really wants to make things better for the poor with housing and things. And I think those things were going on in the 1890s. How you tore old housings down and built new ones. And then sometimes I think if you consciously overestimate the reader, there's one place I would like to ask you about, because Will is writing to Cora a very short letter, but he ends with Philippians 1:3-11.
Yeah.
And do you think most readers go to that place in the Bible?
I
did.
Don't, did you?
Yeah.
I hope so. I'm really interested in this, and I'm a real. I'm terrible, really. I just think people should be educated. I like educating people. I should have been a teacher. So what I would like is to write a kind of book which you can take or leave at any one of a number of levels. Okay, so if you're not interested in Eleanor Marx, you can't be faffed to look up the Bible quotation and you want to skim the bits on sin. It's fine. And I would like to write a book where, if that's your response, you just read it and you enjoy it anyway. But also, if you think to yourself, hang on, is that a direct quote from Eleanor Marx? I'm going to read her speeches. And where is that from in the scriptures? And is that really what hamartia means in Greek? Then you can follow that as well. So I like the idea of a book being generous as possible, and as accessible on as many levels as possible. So I don't think it matters if you don't look it up, but I think if you did look it up, it would be a delight.
I think we shouldn't say what's in that Philippians, because we want everybody to go home and look it up.
And now I'm worried I've done the wrong quote.
The Philippians 1:3-11.
That's right.
And I looked it up, and it's really important for the understanding of the letter.
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
Home you go.
You can have a gold star for having looked it up.
There's one thing about this book also. It's about feelings, of course. And there's a lot of strong feelings and intimacy and being afraid of intimacy also. And I was wondering about, you could interpret this book as if friendship is more important than passion. Yeah. And you have a quote from Montaigne in the beginning. I love that quote. And I love that place in Montaigne. You could go home and look that up too. It's, if you would ask me why I loved him, I could not say something like that. I could not say anything but because he was he and I was I.
Yeah.
And that is as close to love as you can come, but it's on friendship.
Yeah. Yes, it's a novel about friendship. And the quickest route to making me feel, I got the book wrong, is when people call it a romance. It is a romance in a way, but what Cora and Will have, and what Stella and Francis have, and what Luke and Cora have, and what Martha and Luke have, and what Cora and Martha have, are friendships. And I'm quite impassioned about this. And one of my areas of research in my vaguely academic life is the status and nature of friendship in literature and society. And I've lectured on it a couple of times via Tennyson's In Memoriam. So I think what's very hard for us to understand as a society obsessed with monogamous sexual relationships as being the ultimate aim in life, where weddings cost £30,000 or £40,000, where marriages crumble because someone kissed someone else in a stationery cupboard, and the physical connection is like the only thing that's, you know, it's considered to be the primary thing that bonds people together, sort of sexually fixated society. I don't think that's liberated us. I think it's created a new kind of emotional puritanism where people are afraid of emotional intimacy unless it's sort of sanctioned by being this monogamous sexual relationship of whatever gender. And it's very hard for us to understand that for centuries, friendship was considered to be as beautiful and as intimate and as rare and as enriching and special as marriage and romantic relationships. So Tennyson's In Memoriam, probably the greatest lyric poem of the 19th century in English, was written to the memory of his best friend Hallam, who died 30 years before, and it contains a very famous line, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." That's about friendship. Michel de Montaigne, when his best friend died, Etienne de la Bertie, he was just devastated, and he tried to understand why they were friends, and the only thing that he could come up with was because he is he and I was I. That was it. And while preparing research for my lectures on friendship and for this book, I met up with a fellow writer friend who I don't see very often, about every couple of years. And we happened to both be in London at the same time, and we went and had pizza, and he's a very clever chap. And he said, "Why are we here? Why are we doing this? This is the weird thing about friendship. When you have a partner, you're getting sex, possibly children, someone to share the bills, someone to help you with the washing up, and a sort of building block of society, right? So it makes sense that you invest in this relationship because it's giving you all of this necessary stuff. Friends, the intimacy that you nurture with friends, you're not getting that out of them necessarily, and yet they're still very precious and very special. So the book's dedicated to my best friend, enormously to his embarrassment, which was the whole point. And yeah, I just think it's a very interesting area of emotional connection that has been forgotten. And I think that our obsession with sex means that you could have two friends of the same gender or different genders who hold hands, and then they think, "Oh, this must be a sexual relationship." Whereas for centuries, people had physical expressions of love all over the place, you know. Women shared a bed very regularly and would embrace. Men were very affectionate and touched each other in intimate ways in public. And it's really recent that people don't express themselves in that way. So.
Yeah, the whole 19th century, or the early 19th century at least, that I studied a lot, you can read letters about people who died, and a man would say about another man, "He's dead, my heart is a widow."
Absolutely, yeah. There's this amazing, so when I've researched this, I sort of researched loads of letters going back hundreds of years, including to Philippians, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, wrote to his friend. He hadn't seen his friend for ages, and he said, "When I think about you coming to see me and getting off the train, my whole being runs towards you with my arms open." And, you know, love Samuel, you know, and what happened was what they call queer panic, basically. So everybody suddenly became absolutely terrified that people might think that they were not heterosexual, and so they stopped expressing these things.
Is that Victoria's fault too?
No, well, she didn't believe it existed between women, did she? She just wouldn't have it. She didn't. Well, this is a slightly flippant remark, but in a way, homosexuality is a 20th century invention. So the idea that your sexual state is fixed and is wrong is early 20th century. So before then, men were able to show affection to each other because obviously you have cases like Oscar Wilde, but generally speaking, you would be able to write a letter like that to your friend. If you did that in the 40s, you might get beaten up for suspected, you know, being gay. So we like to think that we're always progressing. And of course, you know, we have equal marriage now. We have so many more rights for members of society now than we did. But in another way, we've lost something, which is the idea of intimacy being very broad and very complicated and very rich and not reserved just for your partner.
If you look at the couples who are really close friends in your book, they also are very different from each other. And that's one of your points. I mean, not only Cora and Will, but also Spencer and Luke, for instance.
Yes, yeah.
And that the differences really, the friendship and intimacy always overcome those differences, but are also nurtured by those differences.
Yeah, I feel that closeness comes about. There are little points in life that can either fracture or glue, and if they glue, then the relationship, whether it's a friendship or partnership or a marriage, kind of becomes stronger. So some relationships will just break apart over a row, over something very minor, but in the Essex Serpent, things like Luke being mutilated in the way that he was caused his friendship to bond. Whereas this is slightly spoilery, but not terribly. You know, Cora responds to him in a very damaging way, and it broke their friendship. So everything is so complex, and I'm conscious that the book asks questions without answering them, I think.
Yes.
Which I think is good.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd want to read a book that told me what to think.
No, I don't think so either. But at the same time, you are really also interested in the difference between good and evil. What is it being good? Does it exist?
Yes, I mean, I'm in a very strange post-religious state in which I do believe there to be an absolute and an objective right and wrong, I think. I believe in original sin only in the sense of everyone being equally capable of failure and consequently equally subject to redemption. So one of the things that I find myself doing in my post-religious state is inverting theology and making it happy and palatable to me. So you can take the Doctrine of Original Sin, which comes up in the book, and you can read it as being a devastating thing. You know, that we're all sick with this worm of wickedness. Or you could take it to mean what I now take it to mean, which is that we are all equal in our frailty, and consequently where one person falls, they are no worse than us, and they are equally as capable of being raised again. And I remember this coming up years ago at school when I was about 12. Do you know about Rosemary and Fred West?
No.
Tell
us.
It was, I won't tell you too much because you'll never sleep again. But when I was about 12, they discovered that this married couple in Gloucestershire had raped and tortured to death dozens of young women, including their own children, and that they'd been kept in cages underneath their house and so on. And it was horrendous and really shocked the whole of the UK, the idea that a county like Gloucestershire, which is very beautiful and very remote, could have harboured unspeakable wickedness. And everybody said they're monsters. And I said, no, they're humans. And they said, I was 12, we were having a debate at school, and I said, these aren't monsters. If you say they're monsters, you're exculpating yourself from the possibility of doing wicked things. And I was deep in the church at the time, and I said, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And someone threw their pencil case at me, quite rightly. But, you know, I may have moved on from that deeply Old Testament reading of original sin, but I don't think there are monsters. I just don't. I think there are people who do monstrous things, and I think the political upheavals of the last 2 years has really demonstrated that. You know, that there is constantly simmering underneath the surface fear and loathing in people that we all like, and you didn't know it was there, and then something gives them the liberty to show their hatred of certain sectors of the population.
And this is what happens when people think there's a serpent, a monster.
That's right. I was asked a lot if it was a Brexit novel, but I can't tell the future, unfortunately. And when I was writing it, I had no idea that my country would shoot itself in the face by voting Brexit, never mind the foot. And so it's not consciously a Brexit novel, but
it
of
has
course
some symbolic values.
Yeah, and you know, I'm interested in England's insularity. I'm interested in where it comes from. I'm interested in communities as bodies of people and what that means. I should just tell people that I'm a prophet and I predicted Brexit, shouldn't I? It'd be good for headlines.
There is a figure in your book, Francis. He's a young boy, and he today we would say that he is autistic, I think. And it really seems to me that you have studied this kind of boy who is obsessed with gathering things, collecting things, and who has some kind of disorder.
This is potentially quite a contentious area, and I think I've wound some people up with this character. Yeah. I have an autistic nephew, and the son of a very close friend of mine is autistic. And so I'm very interested in autism, and I'm also very interested in how one pathologizes human behavior. So autism is not something for which there is a blood test. It is a name for behaving in certain ways, as you all know. And there are some people who are profoundly autistic, non-verbal, really struggle with any kind of stimulus from the outside. But there are also some people who, prior to the term autism, nobody would have thought them especially strange. So the character of Frances is really a challenge in some ways. What do we call normal? And how helpful is it to say this is abnormal and you must change? Now, there's, I think, good work on autism doesn't say this is abnormal. It says this is how you are, here's a few coping mechanisms, we'll tell your teacher so they know not to make you be part of the school play or whatever. But there are some readings of it that are very, you're ill now. You know, what made you ill? Was it this injection? Was it aluminium in your whatever it was? Someone tweeted yesterday it's to do with restraining children in car seats when they're children, when they're babies. And actually Frances's behaviour, I think, is very rational. So there's a scene where Frances is at a party and he's 11 and his mum is behaving really strangely. Everyone's being a bit off and he doesn't really grasp what's going on. So he sits under the dining table and he recites the Fibonacci series. Okay? Now, I think that that is a completely reasonable thing to do. When you just don't understand what's going on around you, recite a series of numbers that will never change until you feel a bit more like you've got a grasp on things. In one way, that is a classic autistic behaviour pattern. He was overstimulated and retreated back to safe behaviours. In another way, sort of what I do. You know, I don't say the Fibonacci series, I recite a Gerard Manley Hopkins poem called The Wind Hover. But it's a very similar thing. The poem will never change. Gerard Manley Hopkins is dead. I know the poem. If I'm having a tooth taken out, or I have insomnia, or I'm a bit overwhelmed, I will sit and mentally recite The Wind Hover. I'm not autistic, I don't think.
Do you think that the epoch in which you were born, 1880, was more tolerant towards different behaviours?
I'm firmly convinced that it was, and there's a number of reasons behind this. You have to remember that people were very, very used to being up close with people who had mental health problems, amputations, terrible skin disorders, disorders of the mind that couldn't be cured. So to us, somebody who has a severe facial scarring would be treated in a very, very different way, which would cause them to respond in a very different way and cause a degree of isolation. In an era when people still were getting smallpox, you were quite lucky if you didn't have a nasty facial scar by the age of about 25. And so I just think that a lot more was accepted amongst people. Obviously, there were very tight manners and mores about what you would say to people, how you would address them, you know, what you would do on certain days of the year, and all of this kind of stuff. But we forget that it wouldn't have been at all surprising to see someone without a nose. Just wouldn't have been, because lots of people had syphilis.
So the question is, do we sort of overlook a lot of geniuses today because of... I'm thinking, for instance, since you mentioned series of numbers, I was thinking about the mathematician Gauss.
I don't know about him.
Now, he was German, and he invented a lot of series and the Gauss curve. I'm sure you've heard about it. He was obviously autistic. And nobody would have let him become a professor of maths at a university today. But somebody helped him then.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they saw that there was something. And
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I know that with friends of mine who have achieved a diagnosis for their child with autism, the whole drive has been to ensure that they make the most of the opportunities that they've got. But I'm worried that there may be a flip side, and that there may be you hear people say, oh, that man was really rude to me, he was a bit autistic. I've never met a rude autistic person. I just haven't. My nephew isn't rude, my friend's son isn't rude, and my friend who's autistic isn't rude. It's not a thing. But it's become an insult now. So it's this weird, again, it's this idea that we haven't progressed as far in the last 110 years as we like to think. We like to think that we've become infinitely more benevolent and accepting, but I'm not convinced that we always have.
at the same time, you describe an epoch in time where progress was on everybody's mind. It's really about progress too. I mean,
Yes.
progress in medicine, progress in the sciences, and Cora is somebody who runs around in the landscape and is looking for fossils.
Yeah.
And this. I mean, she's collecting too. She's very much like her son.
She is, yeah. Yeah.
And this interest in progress and what science can do and what knowledge can do is something that you really explore in the novel.
Yeah, Cora uses a phrase where she's talking to some schoolgirls who are terrified of the idea of the Essex serpent. And she says, you only need to shine light on something to not be afraid of it anymore. And she said, if you see something frightening in the corner of your room, if you shine a light on it, it's just a pile of old clothes. And so that is enlightenment. So the novel is about enlightenment in all kinds of senses, a sort of emotional enlightenment, scientific.
But does she overestimate enlightenment?
Oh, she's dreadful. I did an event recently for Radio 4, and it was going to be broadcast on Easter Monday, so it's a big event. And a girl came along who I think... Yeah, she was a very interesting young woman, and she just couldn't bear the book. And she kept asking really confrontational questions, and it was fantastic because it forced me to really think about things. And she said, oh, why did you bother having Cora interested in fossils? She never does any fossil hunting. She's rubbish. I don't get why everyone liked her. And I thought, it's an excellent point. Why didn't she do more fossil hunting? And it's because, she's always overreaching herself, isn't she? She thinks she's really interested in this thing, and she gets her head turned by this relationship, and then she's sort of enamoured of the doctor, and then he goes a bit too far and she doesn't want to hear from him anymore. So she's a bit hopeless, actually.
I think you're a bit unfair now.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Because in a way I think this is also a very feminist novel.
Yes.
It's about strong women and
Yes.
women who choose their lives.
Well, I'm going to cross my legs now. I'm not fond of the phrase strong women for a number of reasons.
Okay.
I feel that in literature, for a woman character to be admired and spoken of fondly and remembered, she must be strong. So she must display qualities that we think of as being intrinsically male. Whereas a male character can be petulant and foolish, like King Lear, can be deceitful and equivocating, like Hamlet, can be brutish and barely able to string a sentence together, like Heathcliff, but we will still adore them. I can't bear Heathcliff.
Quite true.
So Cora is self-indulgent and selfish and slightly foolish, but she also has agency. She has agency of her imagination. She has agency over her body. So I would like us, at some stage, not necessarily now, but generally, the world of literature, to find a way to talk about interesting, compelling women in literature without using the word strong. Because you ought to be able to have a female character who is as petulant as Hamlet, as foolish and needy as Lear, as brutish as Heathcliff, but to still be the main character. It shouldn't be a prerequisite of a woman that they know their own mind and they're strong and determined. So I know what people mean when they say strong woman character, but no one ever says strong male character.
I take the point.
I'm so sorry to disagree with you. I feel very rude.
No. I'm not sure you do disagree with me, because I'm not sure that I define strong women the way you do. The strength.
It's a semantic thing. Yeah.
It's English.
Yeah. I think it depends what people mean by strong, doesn't it? And I think in English, if you say strong, it's just so heavily hung about with masculine qualities. So that's why we need another word.
That's true. But
I'm not quite sure what it would be.
But they are so different, the women in the book, and that is an important point. That Cora, she chooses her liberty. She chooses not to be feminine, for instance, because that gives her freedom.
Yeah.
But then you have Stella, who is sort of something. She's really out of a Victorian novel.
She is, yeah. I had an enormous amount of fun with Stella because I wanted to do that thing where you take a really famous trope. The wife of the vicar, the parson, has consumption, but which is an absolutely classic Victorian trope of a lady with consumption. So what I wanted to do was to take the classic Victorian trope and turn it upside down. So because this is 1890 something, 10 years since Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacteria, tuberculosis is treated in a fairly modern way, defined as being a bacterial disease. So I wanted to take the idea of this sort of, you've put another consumptive woman into a 19th century novel, and show microscopes, phlegm slides, bacteria, pulmonary pneumothorax, injections, Robert Koch, and so on. But Stella is suffering from spes phthisica, which is a noted and real condition in which people with late-stage tuberculosis begin to feel a kind of euphoria. So the reason why consumptive patients tend to be associated with beauty and goodness and a sort of holy state is because of spes phthisica. It's a real thing. And so she is dressed in blue and collecting blue objects and talking to the god and imagining that she can sacrifice herself and save the village. And she's a very eerie and strange, fairy-like presence, but in her own way has agency because she's decided what she's going to do with her body.
And she's not at all anxious about the relation between her husband and Cora, which is also something very typical for her.
Yes. Yeah, she's sort of very serene. And one thing that I very much didn't want to do is to write one of those books where a man's eye wanders because his wife is a shrew and just a horrible person. So of course he finds another woman. You know, if only life were that straightforward, you know. So Will loves his wife very deeply and she's very lovable. That doesn't mean that he doesn't also develop a very intimate connection with someone else. Again, it's all about equivocation and no straight answers, nothing too black and white.
And as Cora says, if you love there, what says that you can't love here?
Yes. Yeah, it's I think I've never been able to come up with a decent analogy, so you're going to have to make do with this one, which is that I think we have a tendency to think of our love as being like a cake, and if someone has this slice, then that slice is gone, and then you give out another slice, and then you run out. There's no more for anyone else.
Taught us.
Yeah, but it's more like the rain. One person gets wet in the rain, 10 people are equally wet. So it's like it's an endless source, and Will thinks that, you know, that's it. He's portioned himself off. He has a very modern sensibility in that sense, whereas Cora has a more Victorian sensibility, which is, well, why would you think that, you know...
The one excludes the other.
Yeah.
That's true. I wonder... There's time for some questions.
There's two things to say about the way I sort of approach nature. And the first one is this, that I wrote the book in real time. So I began it in January and wrote the month of January in January, wrote the month of April in April, and I wrote the book in 10 months. And I travelled to Essex when I could, so that I could observe the natural world at the time. So someone was furious on social media that I had bluebells in March, and I had stood in an Essex garden in March and seen bluebells, and they wouldn't have it. They absolutely wouldn't have it. And so I wanted it to be very accurate about the turning of the seasons, because that's something I'm quite attuned to myself. It's the vernal equinox today, so it's a good time to talk about it. But actually, I don't think I needed to travel, because I know Essex so well, and it's really in my blood. And in a way, writing about place at a remove is beneficial, because your memories sift the uninteresting things out, and you retain the stuff that's most vivid and most dreamlike. And that's the effect that I was striving for. If I wanted a much more pernickety nature writing sort of thing, where I was talking about the exact nature of the soil, then so when I think, if I close my eyes now and think of Essex, I see things like a field of linseed, which is blue. Then over the other side of the road, a field of rapeseed, which is white, bright yellow, and these two sort of flags of colour. Now, I don't know if they come at the same time, but for the purposes of the writing, it sort of doesn't matter, because the effect is the vividness of the countryside. So I was always trying to strike a balance between the accuracy, you can get bluebells in March in Essex, and allowing imagination to enrich the natural world. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.